We're out in the Marshlands, which is a strange area of Norfolk between two rivers, the Great Ouse and the Nene. It's very quiet today, but in centuries past, this was a quite different area, an area of water and islands, of busy ports and some magnificent churches, including the one behind me, which is Wigan Hall St Germans. Wigan Hall St Germans has what's probably the best range of late medieval bench ends in the whole of Norfolk. There are several series. There are mythical creatures, there are the seven sacraments, but probably best of all, the seven deadly sins. Each bench end shows the person committing the sin and being drawn into the jaws of hell. And this one, you won't be surprised to learn, is lust. And here's something else rather wonderful. A mermaid holding a comb and a tiger with a mirror. To the medieval imagination, they were both symbols of vanity. And here's another church on the banks of the River Great Ouse. This is Wigan Hall St Peter. It's a splendid ruin, though in fact it's not an ancient one. This church was still in use into the 1930s. There are 4 Wigan Hall parishes altogether, and this is the church of another one, Wigan Hall St Mary the Virgin. The church is at the end of a long track, and it's no longer in use, it's redundant, and it's in the care of the church's Conservation Trust. Inside, there's another splendid collection of bench ends and a very fine rood screen. We've left the Wigan Halls behind and we've come into the Tilneys. This is Tilney All Saints. This is one of the great Norfolk churches. And you may be wondering why so many of the churches around here are so large. It's important to remember that this part of Norfolk was much busier half a millennium ago. It was possible for seagoing vessels to reach places like this up the River Ouse, so there was plenty of money about. They built a long church here in the 12th century, and then in the 15th century, merchant wealth left the church looking how it is today. Let's go inside and have a look. Thanks to the wealth of Tilney All Saints over the centuries, there's a happy mixture of architecture here. The long arcades stretching away into the distance with their Norman arches are 12th century, and above them is a 15th century angel roof. And then about 1600 there was more money spent here, which brought this most unusual font, and in the distance behind me a rood screen, neither of which are medieval. We're moving away from the Ouse towards the Nene, and this is Terrington St John. It's a big, clumsy, quirky church that I've always liked a lot. Curiously, Pevsner tells us that the tower was once separate from the body of the church. Now, why would that be, I wonder? And so from Terrington St John, we've come to Terrington St Clement. And this is probably the Marshland's greatest architectural moment, a huge cruciform church. Now, when it was being built, there was a plan to put a central tower above the crossing, but that didn't happen. When they came to build the tower at Terrington St Clement, instead of putting it up there at the crossing, they built it separately beside the church, and it isn't joined on. And there's a very good reason for this. The ground down here is really soft, and if you join a tower to a church and the tower sinks into the ground, it takes the church with it. We've crossed the Nene into Cambridgeshire and we're at Elm, which is just to the south of Wisbech. Now, in the early 13th century, they rebuilt their church here and were proud to give it a new tower in the style of the West Tower of Ely Cathedral. But within 10 years of the tower being erected, it had started to sink into the ground. The tower was finished fairly swiftly, but even as it was being completed, it became clear that it was sinking into the soft ground and began to lean towards the south. They must have watched it with some despair. Fortunately, it stabilised itself after a while, but it had taken the tower arch with it, and today it is still slightly on the hoof. Unsurprisingly, local parishes learned a lesson from what had happened at Elm. Here at West Walton, which is just the other side of the Nene, they built a new church in the early part of the 13th century, And when they built the tower, not only did they build it separately, but they built it a fair way from the body of the church. West Walton is an unusual church for Norfolk. It was built in one single campaign in the 1240s in an early English style, and no expense was spared. They brought the stone from Barnack near Peterborough, and these arcades have these beautiful fluted columns. And so we come to our last church of the day, and we've saved the best till last. I'm in a tunnel which runs under the chancel of one of the great churches of the Norfolk Marshland. This is Walpole St Peter. This is a place of the play of light and shadow on old wood and old stone. The bench that I'm sitting on is from the 15th century, and there are also box pews and a range of benches from the 17th century. It's the kind of place that really affects you with its atmosphere. It's a strange thought that this magnificent church was built largely as the result of an accident, because in 1330 a flood swept away its predecessor. Later in that century, after the Black Death, work commenced on what is probably the most beautiful church in Norfolk, and by the middle of the 15th century it was complete. The world has moved on. The medieval merchant wealth and the seagoing ports of this area have gone. The rivers have silted up or have been diverted and found new courses. But the churches remain, and there can be few areas of England with so many wonderful churches as the Norfolk Marshland.